the relationship between BDS, Israel, and anti-Semitism. Our program this afternoon will explore these questions, first with talks by our three panelists, and then through discussions with you, our audience members. So we can get started. I'm delighted to introduce our first presenter, Ahmad Awad. Ahmad is a lifelong New Jersey resident who received his BA in history from Fordham University in New York City. While there, he attempted to establish a chapter of Students for Justice in Palestine. But Fordham refused to allow this organization to be formed, and Ahmed led a lawsuit against the university, claiming violations of its own guidelines, as well as viewpoint discrimination. Ahmad is currently a second-year JD candidate at Rutgers Law School in Newark.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to first thank Jewish Voices for Peace for having me here today. I would also like to say a happy Hanukkah to all those in the room that are celebrating. I would like to start with a just simple discussion on what the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement is. So the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement looks to use nonviolent means to pressure the Israeli government to meet its obligations under international law and its occupation of Palestinian lands, as well as full equality for the Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel. The reason why I am so engulfed into this situation and support for the BDS movement and overall support for Palestinian human rights is my two histories of oppression that I grew up with taught me to value human dignity and fight injustice wherever I see it. My father's side of the family are Palestinians who were born in the West Bank prior to the establishment of Israel, and my mother's parents were survivors of Nazi occupation during the Second World War. They were Polish Catholics. My grandfather was a survivor of Nazi labor camps. I saw what inhumane and injustice does to people. I've seen him be dispossessed of his homeland. He never returned back to Poland. He was put into displaced persons camps and eventually migrated to the United States, where he set up his life, had a family, and lived here, where he continues to live to this day. When the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement first started, I thought this is a phenomenal way to really bring attention to the Palestinian cause. Notably because I saw what had happened in South Africa and what had happened around the world, even here in the United States. And specifically, once I learned more about the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, I decided that it's more important to understand how it applies to us here as Americans in the United States. Because of my advocacy for the BDS movement, I've had a lot of critics claim that I'm anti-Semitic, I'm hating towards the Jewish people, which is completely false. A number of my friends, my closest friends, are Jewish Americans. I have no hatred or disregard for Jewish life. I have no hatred or disregard for any human life. I simply am looking to allow for Palestinians to have the same rights of equality and the same rights of life that others around the world are able to have. To begin with, I would like to first speak on why the BDS movement is necessary. Soon after the establishment of the State of Israel, after which 700,000 plus Palestinians were expelled from their lands, the Israeli government began to enact numerous laws which would limit the rights of Palestinians that resided in Israel, as well as those who lived in the occupied territories after 1967. To this day, there are more than 65 Israeli laws that exist that discriminate against Palestinians in Israel and the occupied territories. For example, 93% of land in Israel is public and belongs to the state, the Jewish National Fund, and the Development Authority. Arab Palestinian citizens of Israel are blocked from leasing 80% of that land. In 1950, the absentee property law called that Palestinians expelled after November 29, 1947, are absentees, were denied rights to their land. Their houses, homes, any property, as well as their bank accounts were confiscated, and they had absolutely no right to it. After 1967, the Israeli government began to crack down on Palestinians who lived in East Jerusalem. Since 1967, 15,000 Palestinians from East Jerusalem have had their residency rights revoked and have been forcibly removed from East Jerusalem. Seeing these laws continue to happen, and it's not that they just continue to happen in the past, it's that they continue to happen now, as you could see with the current nation-state law that was just passed, which minimizes the importance of the Palestinian history in Israel, which it also downgrades Arabic to a special status rather than an official language when Israel's population, 20% of it is Arab. Seeing all these injustice and all these laws being passed shows that what are the options? If you go down a violent route, you see what happens. It's impossible to have justice in a violent route. So I began to do a history on how the boycott movement helped in the United States. And in the United States, since the creation of the United States, in the 1760s and 1770s, American colonists, no matter who they were, whether they were from a low socioeconomic class upwards of being very high and wealthy American colonists, they used boycott as a way to crack down on the British rule over the colonies. Prior to the Civil War, abolitionists boycotted goods produced that were used with slave labor. In the 1930s, the American Jewish Congress boycotted Nazi Germany for its discrimination and its hatred towards the Jewish community. In the 1950s and 1960s, the civil rights boycotts, specifically the Montgomery bus boycott, which lasted 381 days, had an estimated 40,000 participants, which was the amount of 75% of the bus riders in Montgomery at the time, brought extreme change to that area and was able to establish a civil rights case that called the discrimination and segregation on buses as unequal and unconstitutional. Seeing how the boycott movement in our history was able to bring such change had me believe that that is the means for my people, for my Palestinian people, to accomplish the same peace that African Americans and Jewish Americans in the civil rights movement looked for, their own equality. Up until today, BDS gets a lot of hatred for being anti-Jewish and anti-Semitic. This is far from the truth. The American Jewish community is strongly behind the BDS movement. They have specifically numerous American Jewish civil rights activists who advocated for basic rights during the civil rights movement, encouraged this route. They know that this worked. They know that they were able to accomplish extreme change here in the United States at a time when it didn't seem like it was even possible. And during this time, it was common for those who would boycott against these inequality for African Americans to be labeled as anti-American and to be labeled as haters of American society. And as we can see now, 50, 60 years from this, that there was extreme change that was able to be accomplished. And it was because of those movements that African Americans were able to have the rights that they have to this day. I'm going to quote now Desmond Tutu, who stated that in South Africa, we could not have achieved our democracy without the help of people around the world who, through the use of nonviolent means, such as boycott and divestment, encouraged their governments and other corporate actors to reverse decades-long support for the apartheid regime. It's obvious that the best way to impact change is to hit people's pockets. When companies start to realize that if they begin to help and begin to support a lot of these oppression around the world, no matter where it exists, that they will start to lose business. They'll realize what they're doing is not right, that they are also supporting injustice. And I believe that with that type of change and with the boycott and divestment sanctions movement, there could be real change for the Palestinians within Israel as well as those who reside in the occupied territories. Now moving away from the boycott movement, but still talking about it, is that in the United States, there's been a lot of crackdown here, even amongst the left wing and right wing, on the boycott movement for calling that the boycott movement is anti-Semitic. There are numbers of laws around the country that are being passed by legislators with bipartisan support that are asking for people who boycott Israel to have repercussions for their actions. I was just reading about a case in Kansas where a public school teacher, Esther Kuntz, decided that she wanted to complete a Kansas State Department of Education training program to qualify her to make some extra money by leading professional development sessions for the state's math and science teachers. After she completed the program and she was contacted by state officials to, fill out some basic paperwork so that she can receive the qualifications, she was told that she must sign a certification verifying that she won't boycott Israel. She stated that she won't, and they refused to pay her. They said that because of the law in Kansas, they cannot hire someone who boycotts Israel. Kuntz decided to file a lawsuit against this, and in Kuntz v. Watson, the federal courts of appeal in Kansas, for the District of Kansas, granted a preliminary injunction preventing further enforcement of this law. They called this law unconstitutional, and it had absolutely no right to be in existence from the get-go. Seeing that there are courts around the world, around this country, that are starting to realize that although governments and legislators can enforce these laws and can vote to have these laws passed, that does not necessarily mean that they're constitutional. Since the 1960s, in the NAACP v. Claiborne Hardware Company case, the Supreme Court held that the First Amendment protects the right of Americans to participate in boycotts. Throughout the later half of the 20th century, we see that these boycott movements continued throughout the country and had an extreme impact on American society. Without the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, specifically being a young Palestinian, I don't see much other options. If you have a people who are oppressed, a people who are segregated and discriminated against constantly every single day, what do you expect from them? I go there, I've been to Palestine a number of occasions. I'm an American citizen. I was born to American citizens. I've lived here my entire life. My mother's Polish, my father's Palestinian. I'm very strong in American politics. I advocate for being an American because being an American is honestly one of the greatest opportunities here in being a human in this world. But to see Palestinians who have zero to none rights in the occupied territories, and I see them go through a day-to-day with no jobs, or unable to attend schools, or constant imprisonment, or, lack of opportunities throughout their communities, even to the most basic situations where when I'm there and I see there's roads where Jewish settlers can drive, but I'm not allowed to drive on those roads because I'm not Jewish. Seeing these firsthand and being stopped by Israeli occupation forces in the occupied territories has really enraged me. But understanding that there must be a rule of law, I understand how the American Constitution works, and I want to bring that elsewhere around the globe. I honestly, truly believe that the American way of law and justice is the best way that we have in the world. And the only way to bring change is by working with these qualities, these great qualities that the Americans and civil rights activists and colonists and anyone in the United States history have used to bring about extreme change. I think that that's the method for Palestinians as well. Violence doesn't work. We see what happens when violence happens. One side will hit the other side will hit back, and the bystanders on the outside will say it's a conflict, it's a war zone, we can't do anything about it. It's going to be having to be dealt with amongst themselves. But if we're able to move on a nonviolent means and bring about a boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement against these Israeli government interests, we can show that it's not necessarily just an issue of the region. It's an issue around the world. It will impact not only Israelis, but it will impact the lives of Palestinians. We need to bring change. There will not be any way of accomplishing this change peacefully other than the boycott movement. It's a shame for Americans who, specifically Americans in government, who consider themselves as social justice leaders, to then be on the end of supporting anti-boycott legislation that will endanger the rights of activists such as myself and such as many of you in this room. As you can see, the BDS movement is bringing change, and it's obviously scaring the Israeli government. They're using this tactic of anti-Semitism because they believe that that is their only way that they're going to be able to try to get a niche society to believe their lies. They know that it's an effective method. They know that there is such a large American Jewish community behind the method. Not even American Jewish community, Jewish communities around this world that support the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement. I believe that soon, slowly but surely, just how as it was in the 1960s, how it was wrong to speak out against African American rights, and it was seen as you are an outsider for advocating for those rights, that soon my children will be able to see that it is okay to advocate for Palestinian rights, that people in our generation today fought for those rights to make it possible for those in the future. As you can see in Kansas, or in specifically last week, how at NYU they passed to support the BDS movement in NYU, which was a complete shock. But it really honestly does a great cause. It shows that the movement is taking off, and it's like wildfire. From where it started, and when I first learned about the movement, I did not know much about it. And it was a small movement amongst the Palestinian groups, and then it slowly started to branch out. And now it's taken such wide stream steam that I honest to God believe that it is going to bring about change. And people who are going against it now will be ridiculed in the future when history writes their judgment. And it's like I said, it's a matter of time. The only thing we can do is be patient. We need to support, we can't stand back. When people stand back and are afraid, nothing will be accomplished. There has to be active support for this. There has to be active support outside of the Palestinian and outside of the Jewish American community. We need to attract attention from countries around the world, communities around the world, from Spanish communities to Asian communities to North European communities. We need to get activists behind this to prove that this is the only route for a justifiable and possible outcome for peace in that region. And I truly believe that with support to this, there will be change, there will be peace inside of Israel, there will be equality of rights for Israeli, Arab, Palestinian citizens, as well as a solution to the occupation in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. I look forward to speaking with you guys on any questions you may have, and I appreciate you guys having me here today. Thank you.